Okay, we are ready to go with the next talk. Our next talk is from Sarah Dayan. She is a principal software engineer, mostly working on open source front-end libraries at Algolia. Yes, the same people who gave you that good coffee. Mostly working with TypeScript, CSS, and she created the Dinero.js library that you might have used if you've been working with monetary values. Always fun. And when she gets into a methodology, she really gets into a methodology, whether it's test-driven development or what she's here to talk about today, utility-first CSS. I know. You have to acknowledge this is a very brave thing that Sarah is doing. She's going to get up here and talk to you about utility-first CSS. And specifically, the title of the talk is Utility-First CSS Isn't Inline Styles. So we are ready for some questions after this. I want you to get in there and ask your questions. Don't hold back. We're ready for this. And please acknowledge the bravery and welcome Sarah Dayan.
Thank you, everyone. This is my very first CSS day. This is the first time I'm coming. And looking at the people here, seeing we have browser engineers, we have people working in the CSS working group. How lucky are we? Honestly, I can understand why so many people have been coming over the years. First time, and I'm already super happy. So let's dive into that maybe controversial topic. No, utility classes are not the same as inline styles. If you've ever played with utility for CSS, this equivalency probably sounds familiar to you. Maybe you think that I'm right. Maybe you think that I am completely mistaken. Or maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about. Regardless, I will make myself clear in a minute. But first, a few words about me. So my name is Sarah Dayan. I'm a principal engineer at Algolia. I do JavaScript, I do CSS. I love cheese. If you talk to me after that, you will find out. Don't, I will never stop speaking. And if you can see me, I have a favorite color. Guess what it is? So I live in Paris, and I've been working in tech for the last 15 years. I have that many years of front-end work behind me, mostly in JavaScript and CSS. And in my career, I've had to answer many recurring questions. For example, I heard a lot of, is CSS even a programming language? To which the answer is, who gives a shit? Yeah. I've also had my fair share of, are you sure you don't want to be an engineering manager? To which I always answer, not in a million years. No offense to any engineering managers over there. You're all doing a fantastic job. It's really just not for me. But for the last few years, the single question I've gotten all the time is, are you the girl on the Tailwind website? And yes, indeed, I'm not going to lie to you. I've been a long fan of utility for CSS, and I still love it to this day. I've written articles about it. I've recorded podcast episodes about it. I spoke at conferences. And so I guess that was the next step. But in case you're wondering, no, I don't work there. And no, I'm not getting paid to talk about it. So if you're not familiar with utility-first CSS, this is a methodology which consists of using single-purposed presentational classes to compose the styles by aggregating them on HTML elements. So this methodology is also referred to as atomic CSS, which arguably is a lot easier to say. So if you don't mind, from this point on, I will say atomic CSS when referring to utility for CSS, so I do not have to drink a whole water bottle at the end of my presentation. In atomic CSS, you treat CSS abstractions as a way to build highly modular visual APIs that you can consume at will. It focuses on what things look like. It opposes itself to semantic CSS, which favors composing complex abstractions in CSS. The technical complexity of what things look like is kept in the style sheet, leaving the HTML unaware of the how. In semantic CSS, you treat CSS classes as a way to abstract away the visual aspect of components into its own layer with a contract that is based on identity. So it focuses on what things are. Atomic CSS has exploded in popularity in a short amount of time. In the last decade, we've seen a boom of enthusiastic thought pieces on the topic. Utility frameworks have grown like weeds, and major web frameworks, for example, Next.js or Remix, now provide built-in support for it. It's a radical stance on how to write CSS. It is a major shift in philosophy, and one that got quite successful. But as any big hit, it comes with many adepts, but also a fair share of skeptics. Atomic CSS versus semantic CSS is one of the hottest, most polarizing debates I've witnessed and participated in the last decade. For the ton of enthusiastic articles, podcast episodes, conference talks, and emerging frameworks, I've seen as many thought pieces and Twitter threads tear it apart, including from highly respected members of the CSS community. And this is a great thing. Opposing techniques do not have to be petty or religious. It doesn't even have to be avoided at all costs, just for the sake of staying positive. Constructive criticism contributes to identifying weaknesses in reasoning. And for those reasons, I have spent a considerable time and effort doing research to weed out the facts from the cliches. Among those cliches, I've researched the myth of separation of concerns and how this has drastically evolved with the rise of component frameworks, and how you cannot only equate separation of concerns with separation of file types. I've challenged the resistance to HTML bloat, arguing that complexity has to exist somewhere in the code base, wherever it is, and how a large HTML file does not have the same impact as a large CSS file. I've also confronted the opinion of it being just ugly, with the suggestion of maybe going past initial knee-jerk reaction, reconsidering what we call understandable, and always putting the success of a project before personal taste or personal preference. If those topics pique your interest, I did a whole conference talk on it that you can check on YouTube. But please don't do it now, because today I would like to focus on one of those myths, just one of those myths, and I hope it can open many doors. And that is that atomic classes are just the same thing as adding inline styles in your HTML. Why? Because despite the fact that it sounds like the most obvious myth to debunk, it is still the one that always comes up in debates, all the time. Trust me, I have huge DMs filled with that. And what I've noticed, though, is that once it clicks, when you get it, the rest usually comes a lot easier. So maybe you're already on board, and this might give you extra arguments to convince your coworkers. Or maybe you're not. And I hope this can start a deep conversation between us, maybe during Q&A or after, during the conference. Ready? Let's dive in. Inline styles only have a local impact. Perhaps the biggest limitation with inline styles is that they can only affect the element that they are on. And this is a crucial difference with atomic classes. Well, that's not entirely true, but hear me out. As with any CSS declaration, inline styles are subject to inheritance. They can impact children if they declare an inheritable property. But that's about all the power they have. And that's because with inline styles, you are declaring styles, not rules. You are not in a style sheet. You are not in a style block, meaning you cannot write selectors. And it cuts you from writing styles for pseudo-classes, for pseudo-elements, complex selectors with combinators, media queries, or even animations. On the other end, atomic classes live in style sheets. They have access to the same powerful features as any other CSS class. For example, they can declare styles for pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. Here we are creating a class that will turn text to red, but only when it's hovered. You can only do this in a style block or in a style sheet. Now, what usually gets most people is that even though you indeed have access to such powerful features, the usage of atomic classes is very similar to inline styles, in the sense that you manually apply them locally in your HTML. See, here we are applying the class on the anchor. It's not like the style that we wrote is not going to affect all the anchors in the page, in the document. It's only going to affect the ones that I apply it to. But this ignores how creative and powerful you can get with atomic classes. For example, you can create grouping classes to style children which parents are being hovered. And this leverages descendant selectors. You can add the group class on a parent and the group hover class on any children that should react to the parent being hovered. Here we want the text in the header to turn red, but when the article is hovered. And this is what happens. And such behavior would not only be impossible with inline styles, but it also brings the concept of relationships between elements. You could create similar utilities based on any pseudo-class, focus, active, whatever. Where inline styles are focused on themselves, atomic classes are aware of context. And you can get more complex than that, and use deeper nesting, selected lists, or even CSS combinators. Atomic classes are about single responsibility and controlled effect. They are not about restricting access to powerful features. So let's look at this very weird piece of code. These peer classes use sibling selectors to show and hide the siblings of elements that have range limitations. Think date inputs or range inputs. And this works with the in-range and out-of-range pseudo-classes that will trigger when the value of the input is outside of the boundaries that you've set. So I know this looks really weird, but no worries. I will show you how this works in a second. In the HTML, you use these classes to express a relationship between sibling elements. So here, the peer class on the date input sets it as the subject. It is the element to watch. And it lets us control the visibility of a sibling element to display an error message if we enter a date which is outside of the min and the max values. So as I enter a date which is out of bounds, the pseudo-class triggers and displays my error message, my custom error message. Both elements are independent. Yet, with atomic classes, we have formed a relationship through a state-driven contract, while remaining highly modular and reusable. Another use case is media queries. For example, so this is Bootstrap. It uses, for grids, it uses media queries to create layout variations across devices of different size. Classes are declared inside a media query, so they only apply within a specific size range. In the same fashion, you can create atomic styles that only apply on devices with certain capabilities. Here, this style only applies on touch devices by targeting the lack of support for hover and the usage of a pointer that has limited accuracy, pointer coarse. You can even create styles that only apply in certain device orientations. Here, this atomic style only applies in landscape orientation. Or you can create styles that only apply in dark mode, and so on, up to the limits of your imagination. So this first one is a subtle yet crucial difference to understand, is that atomic classes have context. Even if usage looks similar, the features and context that atomic classes have make them fundamentally different tools. And it opens the door to patterns. It opens the door to systems design. Not design systems, even though it does open the door to that, but really systems design. They let you architect a rich and complex set of reusable solutions. And this is a quantum leap ahead of just copy-pasting low-level, unruly style declarations. Speaking of unruly, inline styles are unbounded. Inline styles allow you to do anything you want. There are no rules. There are no guidelines. There are no design systems. There is no way to enforce anything. In contrast, atomic classes belong to a CSS architecture with rules and boundaries. They are part of a strategy. They compose a service for developers to use, reuse, and compose. No matter how small classes are, they belong to a system that define color schemes, that define sizing scales, typography sets, radiuses, shadows, and so on. Adding a color to a palette within a system is not as mindless as just adding a style on any element. You are making a conscious decision of enriching a code base. If your product designer decides on a sizing scale for a project, atomic classes will not let you deviate because they are limited. They are a direct projection of what is allowed in the project's design system. They are a library of authorized tokens for you to mix and match, but never to steer away from. Inline styles don't have a strategy. They are escape hatches. They're useful for dynamic styles. They're useful for quick demos or for trying something out before figuring out how to do it cleanly. They are inherently limitless because they need to be. They are your last resort when you need to break the rules. When making the analogy between inline styles and atomic classes, I think, no, we're good. All right, never mind. So when making the analogy between inline styles and atomic classes, what people mean to point out is the messy nature of the two, how they invade the page structure with a swarm of presentational concerns. But this undermines how they actually bring order through the chaos, not only with systems, but also with intent. Atomic classes feel like inline styles because they are small. They use functional names and they live in the HTML. It is very easy to devoid them of meaning for the single reason that they often map one-to-one with CSS declarations. But contrary to popular belief, they are not always single property classes. Do you remember the good old times of building grids with floated blocks? By show of hand, that's a bunch of people. So at that time, the clear fix trick became one of the first widely used atomic class. You added a cleared element after floated blocks to preserve the container's height. And with flexboxes and CSS grids, this has become quite an antiquated technique. But back in the days, you know it, I know it, it was everywhere. Strictly speaking, the clearfix class has no semantics. It is a purely presentational utility. It doesn't tell you anything on what the code base is about, yet it does convey a strong visual intent. They're usually small because they are single-purposed, those classes. But that's an effect. It is not a design principle. Inline styles declare low-level instructions to the CSS engine. These styles do not mean anything. They don't describe atomic visual concepts. They declare individual CSS properties, and that's it. They are meant for the machine. They are not meant for people. They are not meant to be read by humans. Atomic classes are not semantic, I'll give you that, but they are still abstractions. They describe a presentational purpose. And in doing so, they convey meaning and intent to the people who are reading them. And this is an important point to understand because it gets into the philosophy of styling. You may look at these two snippets of HTML and think, this is the same thing. One is inline and the other one is encapsulated, but that's really just the same thing. But it is this encapsulation that actually separates them. You do want encapsulation and naming to convey intent. And this is where atomic classes and semantic classes actually look a lot more like each other than atomic classes and inline styles. The difference, though, is that atomic classes side with the idea that looking at class names in HTML should inform about the visuals. Utility-first or atomic CSS enthusiasts do not make a strong connection between looks and identity. And this is not so much because a card or a list should not always look the same, but because what they reckon is that many more things in a code base could look like a card or a list or an avatar or whatever, each with a number of specificities, of variations that are better kept in a single place. And this philosophy stems from the idea that as you spend time in your HTML, crafting new elements and blocks and pages, it makes more sense to stay there and consume an existing framework of allowed visuals than switching with a CSS file to build entirely new styles and maintain old ones. And this split of where you spend your time leads us to another interesting point about assets lifecycle. And this will sound like a very weird digression, but please bear with me. Inline styles are not cacheable. When dealing with front-end, the concept of caching inevitably comes to play. You want to serve assets efficiently, and you want to reuse as much as possible to save on loading time and on data usage. But with inline styles, you fully miss out on caching. Content and style have radically different growth rates. Content tends to grow linearly and often much faster. If there's anything to cache, it does not last long. Let's take a news site like the New York Times, which publishes hundreds of articles every day and updates posts in real time. The homepage uses the no cache directive, meaning that the HTML responses in the cache will be validated with the origin server before each reuse. With a site that constantly changes with live news, it makes it unlikely for any user to benefit from HTML caching here. Their global style sheet, however, is a different story. The cacheability directive is set to be considered fresh by the CDN for a year. And this demonstrates how we expect style to age compared to content. There are different caching strategies applying to different CSS methodologies. I'm not going to get into that, but conceptually speaking, on a content site, what the site looks like typically lasts much longer than what the site says. And going one step further, I want to take another content site that does use atomic CSS, and this is the Algolia site. The homepage has a max age of 0 with a bunch of additional directives such as proxy revalidate, no cache, no store, must revalidate, blah, blah, blah. All of that indicating the intent of avoiding browser caching. In simpler terms, this content page needs to be as fresh as possible. And when you look at the styles for the same page, the strategy is radically different. As with the New York Times, styles on the Algolia site can stay in cache for up to a year. And it also declares an immutable revalidation directive, indicating that the response will not change over time. And as many sites do, CSS file names are hashed to leverage cache busting. So this ensures CSS resources can confidently be cached forever, if it was possible. These style sheets can be served from the cache for as long as possible because they are not expected to change. And when they do, they will no longer be the same files anyway. You can cache an HTML page, of course. So you can technically cache inline styles. Yet this is a failing strategy, considering that this HTML page will need to revalidate for content reasons way before you even touch the styles. Caching styles in CSS is much more efficient because by nature, their content stays in the same state longer. And yes, it comes at the cost of an additional HTTP request, but we have persistent connection, we have multiplexing. I think we're good with just an extra HTTP request. Atomic classes grow logarithmically because you reuse existing design tokens even when you build new features or when you create new pages. They work wonderfully with aggressive caching strategies. So in contrast, the location of inline styles makes it pointless to ever cache them. All right, we're getting a little bit technical here, and this might look like a very nerdy, very desperate attempt at proving my point. Like, you get it, Sarah. Like, they're not the same, okay? Like, why go down the rabbit hole? Well, one thing I find interesting beyond this technical side-by-side is the parallel that we can make between how often HTML and CSS assets change and how much we, the developers, need to change the source code. Remember earlier when I talked about how the atomic CSS philosophy rests upon the idea of consuming existing abstractions rather than constantly writing new ones? The way I see it, one of the signs of a healthy code base is when you get to spend most of your time focusing on what you have to do. This means spending as little time as possible switching contexts or doing maintenance. In my very early years at Algolia, I've led and maintained the documentation site. And this is this one. And most of my time was spent adjusting content pages, crafting new layouts, or building entirely new complex components like the search, for example. Our stylistic direction was already well defined. And in fact, during my very first year, we've made the site look the way it looks today. And during those months, I've spent a lot of time in CSS files, or exporting SVGs, or everything that you do when you style and you make a website look the way it looks. This was where my focus was. So that was exactly where my time was best spent, in the CSS, in the images. But once we got that down, it was such a breath of fresh air that every time I had to change a page or adjust a layout, I was able to open a single file, make my changes, and be done. No need to add new styles because our custom visual API was already there. No need to check and hunt new styles after removing something, removing a page or a component, because there was no such thing as a new styles. As we kept visual composites in the very place that they were used, all I had to do was to remove the component and let the compiler do its magic. So when I was chatting with PPK about the topic of this talk, he made a good point about the fact that one of the downsides of atomic CSS is that you look at all the classes and you have to mentally compile them. And there is no denying that. But whether you're doing atomic or semantic CSS, you have the same problem. You always have to look at a list of either low-level properties in the CSS or higher-level abstractions in the HTML and figure out what that ends up looking like. But my take is, and that's really just me, you don't have to agree, my take is that over time, as you ramp up on a code base and you see those abstractions used over and over, it becomes second nature to you. However, we tend to minimize the drain of having to remember in what obscure parts of the code base the bits and pieces of a concern-separated feature are kept. We also underestimate the mental load of reviewing pull requests, sometimes many times in a day, with multiple files to review instead of just one. And this is why I enjoy frameworks. Frameworks in general, not just in CSS, not even a specific framework. I enjoy the concept of frameworks. I enjoy the liberating effect of relying on an essential supporting structure that lets me focus on my work and stay productive. A design system is a framework. A library is a framework. A collection of utilities is a framework as well. And as an engineer, I can tell you I enjoy building systems. I bathe in the nerdiness of crafting my own tools and optimizing them, and sometimes even, I will admit it, for the sheer pleasure pleasure of the intellectual challenge that it represents. But after working on so many different code bases, and often have to switch between them in the course of a single day, I immensely value the confidence and the effectiveness you get from reusing the same solid foundation from one project to the next. And as I've grown in my career, and I have less and less time to actually spend coding, what I love the most is realizing that I've either crafted or chosen my tools well enough for them to set me free. All right, that was intense. I've rambled enough. I think this is time to bring it home. And at this stage, I'm confident that we have beaten the dead horse of atomic CSS versus inline styles long enough to remove any remaining doubts. Please don't beat horses. But beyond that, I think that diving into this comparison surfaces deeper topics. Constructive, documented criticism is not only healthy, it is necessary. We have nothing to gain by ignoring the shortcomings of the tools and the methods we use. However, it is very easy to fall for false equivalencies and shape a flawed reasoning from that. There was this Twitter thread a bunch of years ago by Matthias Verreis, which I really liked, where he said, "Your brain rewards you for classifying new information into existing buckets. Looking for similarities is lower energy than understanding new differences." He follows up with, "Proclaiming that the new idea is the same as the old idea gives you permission not to investigate it deeply, stick to the existing reality where you are an expert in the old idea, and the new ones are merely repackaging of your insight." That's true, there are not many incentives for busy individuals like you and I to spend energy on distinguishing new concepts from known patterns. We have work to do. But stating that atomic classes and inline styles are the same thing is more comfortable than digging deeper to understand the differences. And that I understand, because as Matthias says, there is such a fire hose of information that keeping up with even a single topic is impossible. We should be forgiven for not knowing and understanding and keeping up with everything, even if our job is knowing and understanding and keeping up with everything. But let's try to make a habit of this. When you feel, "Oh, I get it," it's just like, then follow up with, "So what makes the new thing different from the old thing?" Limiting what information we want to spend brain power on, it's not laziness, it is self-preservation. Being a developer is exhausting, especially in web. So it is okay to deliberately pass on something or not be interested or decide that now is not the right time. There are plenty of use cases where atomic CSS is not the right tool. It doesn't make it less good for those who like it, and it doesn't make it bad for everyone else. It just makes it sometimes inadequate, just like a screwdriver would be to paint a house. You may also realize that this is not for you because there are no problems to solve. I've chatted with many folks who are perfectly happy with their code base. The entire team is productive. Newcomers ramp up in no time, and they have no technical debt. If that's you, you're a lucky fellow, and I envy you. But this shifts the conclusion from "this approach sucks for those highly fallacious reasons" to "this approach probably make sense in a set of conditions that don't apply to me right now. There's nothing to gain in starting flame wars or getting bigoted about one's favorite thing of the moment. We will all eventually switch projects, switch teams, go work in another company, and have to handle code bases with radically different choices than the ones we once made. And faced with this reality, I think one of the most important muscles we should keep growing is not chauvinism. It is critical thinking. Thanks a lot for listening to my ramblings. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. All right, we got some good questions coming in. That's all good. Thank you very much for that. Got nice and in-depth with the explanations. It's good. But I mean, what's so bad about inline styles? I know you explained some of the techniques, but like, for some things, like just declaring colors, font sizes, whatever, if you're doing it with some atomic class, that you've got a string of text in your HTML, you got that same string of text in your CSS, and then you've got the property and value that actually does the work. I mean, you could just take that property and value and stick it in your HTML. The file size is going to be the same. You could avoid an extra hit for that resource, that external style sheet. I know it could do everything, but what's so bad about inline styles for that kind of stuff?
That's a really good question, because I don't think that inline styles are bad. I think they can be very useful. As I mentioned, they have a purpose. They are escape hatches. They're not designed necessarily for production. You could use them for production. This is probably not a really good strategy, because unless you're working alone, unless there are no other person who will ever touch the code base, what you get from those abstractions that you have with classes, whether they are semantic or atomic, is that you create boundaries, you create rules, where with inline styles, anyone can write exactly what they want. And you can also even solve the same problems, for example, truncation of text, in different ways in CSS. So you could have people using different ways with inline styles. So I don't believe that they are bad. I think they have a purpose, and what happens is that when there is this equivalence made between atomic CSS and inline styles, what usually people want to say is, oh, inline styles were never a good idea for production, and since they are the same thing as atomic classes, then atomic classes are not a good thing. I don't believe that they have the same purpose. They look a lot like each other, but they are not the same for many different reasons.
Could you imagine maybe a tool? Okay, so your team writes in atomic CSS, but before that HTML gets pushed to production, it goes through a tool that, where possible, converts some of that atomic stuff into just regular inline styles. So nobody's writing inline styles, but maybe you get a...
Yeah, this could happen. You could have this CSS file that then gets inlined in the HTML. Why not? But also, why? If that's just meant for final assets that nobody really reads, you only read the source code, the only thing I would probably do is compare file size after compression. And it might not even be a problem. But yes, it could be possible. Although, if you do that, you will miss out on all the features that you get from keeping your styles in a CSS file. Media queries, for example. You would not have access to that. Pseudo classes, you would not have access to that.
Sure, you couldn't do everything. I'm saying for like the stuff that does equate to one-to-one, maybe have that in line, and for the extra stuff, you're going to need an external style sheet, sure. You talked about the value of a framework, whether that's a literal framework like Tailwind or an internal at your organization, you've got a design system that frees you up, it gives you power. But the problem is the rate of change with any framework, whether that is a company's design system. When you talk to anyone with a design system, they'll always complain about it being out of date, or whether it's a library like Tailwind, is that we see from all the other talks about how fast browsers are landing stuff, how stuff becomes baseline, widely available, But if someone's tied themselves to a particular framework, something isn't widely available until it's in that framework.
Yes. There was a very good Twitter thread a while ago. I think it was Sunil Pai who said that you can measure the quality of a library or a system or a framework up to the quality of their escape hatches. And at Algolia, I work on libraries, on front-end libraries, and that's always something that we try to keep in mind. As we enclose people within a system, we also want to give them ways out when they need to be. So I believe a good framework rises to the quality of their escape hatches. They bound you for the things that they have solved, but anything that could be out of that should be still possible. You should be able to write CSS the way you want. That's why those frameworks usually are called utility first and not utility only. You can write classic semantic styles if you want. You can decide, for example, if you don't use a component library like React or Vue or anything like that, and you don't have those encapsulated components, you can decide to extract your styles into semantic classes using the inline atomic CSS classes. And I think that's a great thing. I think we need to always give people the choice. You create a path, but you allow people to deviate from that path. And I think this is, for framework engineers, for library engineers, this is a form of humility. You have not solved it all. Let people break your model, break your framework, observe what they do, and then fix it.
Well, you talk about giving people choice and allowing people to deviate, but I was fascinated by the language you were using. When you're talking about enforcing, you were talking about not deviating, about what's allowed, what's authorized. It sounds to me like you're talking about like decisions are made in one place, maybe it's a design team, and then that gets implemented at a development level, and this is where you don't want people to deviate from what's been decided. That sounds so different from what Matthias was talking about when he was talking about trying to bring those worlds together, working alongside each other. It sounds to me what we've got here is a technical solution to keeping those things very separate.
So that's an interesting point of view. I believe that you can create those design systems, and you should create those design systems together. Product designers should be working with developers, absolutely. When I'm talking about enforcing, and those words are very strong, I'm also talking from the point of view of someone who works in a company of, like, we're close to 800 people. And that's a lot of engineers who come up later in the game and who have to ramp up on how to do things. And that's suddenly a team that used to be two developers building the entire website. And now there are many different distributed teams who are not even on the same time zones, who cannot even communicate properly because they have 24-hour difference.
Is the issue the size, or is the issue more where they're coming from, man, in the sense of their background? Like, are your teams maybe JavaScript developers who kind of have to do CSS because it's fallen on them for some reason? Or is their background in HTML and CSS?
That can be that. It can be that because teams in companies are never perfect. You never have the backend engineer and the front-end engineer and the accessibility engineer, etc. You never have that dream team of every part of the code base has their own specialist. It does not happen. We have many teams where we had backend developers doing front-end until there was a front-end person coming on the team. So this can be about that, like the fact that, yes, in real-world companies, you don't always have the exact headcount that you would want to have. You also have it's the same problem as with communication. If it's not written anywhere, then the rule does not exist. The value does not exist. And so by creating systems, it is not about restricting freedom. It is about creating a language that we decide to speak, all of us together.
So it's closer to documentation, in a way.
It is actually closer to documentation. And trying to make sure that we remain productive about the things that we should care about. We do not constantly reinvent the wheel. I've seen that countless times. You have a new team that ends up creating a new dev tool for themselves that someone already crafted 8 years ago. You do not want that. You want to have a good idea of what already exists, what are the problems that have already been solved, why those choices have been made. You can still question them, you can still open a new ticket, but at least you come through the idea that you need to be humble and start by understanding the choices that have been made prior to your arrival in a company.
In service of efficiency.
Of efficiency, of consistency, and productivity.
Productivity, efficiency, consistency. Good capitalistic values. Look, I think we can all agree that we can mix and match these things, right?
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned ClearFix. That's an atomic class. And I've used atomic classes for stuff like fonts and you know, other stuff that gets defined in a design system.
Yes.
But maybe I don't go the whole way. And that's okay, right? We can mix and match, and it's okay to take what we need and discard the rest. We don't have to go all in, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Again, that's utility first for me. It's not utility only. And also, you do whatever you want. Again, to me, that's really dependent to the scale of your project.
Yeah.
If you're all alone on a project, why bother? Just do you. But what I enjoy, again, when I switch to a brand new project, and sometimes you learn about that 24 hours before a reorg.
You like to be able to pick it up and just go with it.
Yeah, it's pretty nice that you're able to land on a code base that uses the same tooling as the ones that you've used before.
It's very efficient. So Sarah and Rachel will both be available for you to talk to upstairs, and that's by the help desk. You'll be able to ask all your CSS questions of the specialist from Google there. We are going to have a lunch break now, and I want you back in your seats at 1:55 for the next talk. The buffet will be upstairs, so head on up there. But do remember, no taking your cups and plates into this room. Before you head to lunch, please give it up for Sarah Dayan.
Thank you.